Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival. I am Dale Walker, and joining me here in the studio today we have Clem Skurterdin, who is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where she is leading the systemic initiative looking at food and its relation to cities. And joining us online we have Jaap Strengers, who joins from Systemic, where he focuses on topics related to food and agriculture and the circular economy. And we're going to look at this issue of food in the 21st century and how cities interplay with that. Clem, let's start with absolutely, in my opinion, the most important question of the session. Are we going to run out of food?
That's a good question, Dale. Several numbers have been put forward, and you picked up on the 60 years left of harvest. I think what is for sure known is that the question behind this is, at the pace at which we are degrading soil, agricultural soil, there is definitely a threat for us to be able to feed the world population in a short term. This is certain. What is the exact number of years left? We don't know, but what is for sure, we've already degraded a third of our agricultural land, and it takes 1,000 years to build 3 centimeters of topsoil.
1,000 years to rebuild topsoil.
So it's time to take stock of these numbers and act differently.
Absolutely. So you referenced there a statistic that we had in the session introduction, which was that there is 60 years of food left, or 60 harvests left. Maybe Jaap, I can turn to you. Clem mentioned that that's to do with this thing called soil degradation. Can you maybe elaborate on what that means?
Sure. It's basically the process that is a result from, to a large extent, the kind of agriculture practices that we have these days, which are a combination of different, let's say, issues. Both the chemical inputs that we use combined with what's called monocropping, so you're basically using one produce the whole time, combined with tillage that disturbs the soil. So it's really a sum of a compounded effect of multiple different things coming together that in many cases is indeed reducing soil quality and erosion. The other thing indeed is this thing called erosion is also soil is being washed away because of it's not holding the water anymore, and so it's being eroded. And climate change actually is also impacting negatively the soil quality.
Clem, do you have anything to add to that, soil degradation?
Yeah, actually on the point of climate change, I think what's important to realize is that we definitely need soil to feed ourselves. 95% of our food is coming from soil. But I think we should not also overlook the role that soil has in fighting climate change. Soil is required to sequester carbon. And the less soil, the less ability to sequester carbon. And this is obviously creating a vicious cycle, and that is preventing us to fight climate change. Yeah.
So this sequestering of carbon, that's what's also known as kind of carbon drawdown? Is that another term for that process? Okay. Jaap, you mentioned kind of monocropping as one of the causes of this soil degradation. Can you give us an idea maybe of how that dominant agricultural technique came about? Is there a reason, can we point to, for the rise of monoculture?
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the key drivers for where we are now is a huge population growth combined with wealth growth over the last decades and hundreds of years in many ways, leading obviously to a need to feed a growing population. And so, for very good reasons, have we just been making sure that there was enough food, which arguably is not fully the case yet, but really having catching up also on kind of providing more food to people everywhere and lifting people out of poverty. And so in many ways, actually the way you can think about it is it's also been quite successful in an interesting way by simply providing enough food, or increasingly enough food for increasing amount of people. And so that's obviously what's been optimized for, but at the expense of the soil health issues and other issues around, for example, pollution, and even the emissions for the greenhouse gas emissions themselves, and lots of other things like biodiversity loss, etc.
So in a way, we're kind of victims of our own success of the food industry and our ability to create so much food to feed a growing population. Just before we move on, I want to remind those of you who are watching online right now that one of the hallmarks of the Disruptive Innovation Festival is participation and your ability, indeed, to get involved in this conversation. I obviously have some questions prepared here, but it would be fantastic if all of the questions today didn't come from me. So make sure that if there is something that's burning on your mind that you want these guys here to answer around the topic of food, that you can send those questions through to us. And there's a few ways you can do that. Twitter is really easy to use. Simply use the hashtag ThinkDiff and send your question through, where our producer sitting outside the studio will fire them through to me and I'll get them to our panelists. If you're not versed in the use of Twitter, then if you're watching on the Diff website, thinkdiff.co, you'll see just off to the right-hand side of this video screen, there's a comments section. You may have to log in, but you can also say that you're a guest if you don't want to do that, and you can post your questions there. And third, we have the YouTube page where you might also be watching. So plenty of ways for you to get your questions in, and I promise I'll ask them to our panel. So monoculture, this kind of dominant agricultural system that we have at the moment, it makes me think that kind of it can't be very good for our health. There must be a health kind of impact of this. Is there kind of something to say on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's probably what's the most concerning about our food system, which is even if you make the right dietary choices for yourself, even if you consume healthy food, you might still be affected by health issues that are related to the way we grow food. So one of them is, for example, antimicrobial resistance, due to the fact that we are over-treating livestock with antibiotics. Another one is air pollution. Actually, agriculture is the top source of fine dust particle in regards to all over human activities combined. I don't know, Jaap, if you want to add some more, because the list doesn't stop there, actually.
No.
No, indeed. I mean, we talked a bit about the chemical inputs, indeed, and the runoff that creates. It ends up a lot in water, where of course you can treat it, but that's not always done properly. So, and maybe one interesting way I find actually to think about the food and agriculture system overall is it's maybe one of the few or one of the most multi-dimensional systems, if you will, right? So a lot of other systems like, and I'm going to simplify now, but let's say energy, that's really to a large extent about emissions and getting the emissions down. The more I look at food and agriculture, the more I realize that yes, it's a climate change, but there are lots of other issues around resource use, as well as health, as we just talked a bit about, as well as overall waste that's being created, obviously. And so, which also kind of shows a bit how incredibly complex it is, right? Because just optimizing for, let's say we've optimized for yields. If we now only optimize for health, we're still stuck with a lot of other issues at the same time.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely one of the more complex ones to solve.
It certainly sounds like it. And Clem, you mentioned kind of that these health implications are, a lot of them are completely unknown to us, to those of us who are eating the food that we buy in the supermarket. I mean, I guess we see a lot of kind of public campaigns about diabetes, about obesity, and kind of things that we need to do to combat that. But I've never heard it, certainly, of some of these things, the antimicrobial resistance. Kind of how do we go about? Do we need to educate people about that, or how do we change the system in a little way to make that more apparent?
Yeah, I think it's about changing the way the system works, for sure. Like we just discussed, some externalities are coming from the way food is consumed, such as diabetes or obesity, or part of the obesity that is related to food consumption. But some are definitely linked to the way we produce food, and I think this is for the system to be, in a way, put back into a healthy trajectory. And when I mean healthy for people, but also healthy for natural resources and all the other systems that are interlinked with the food system. And Jaap is really right, food is interlinking with air, water, energy, health, land, and so many others. It is really the mother of all complex systems, as it has been said before. So yeah, there's really a lot to do here.
Absolutely. And you are together are working on a project at the moment that is examining this issue, this enormous kind of complex system, but you've narrowed it down to cities. You're focusing in on cities. Can you give me a bit of an idea of why, Clem, perhaps you've chosen to look at cities?
Yeah. So we see cities as a powerful entry point to start influencing the food system. So cities by 2050 will be places where 80% of the global food will be consumed. They are also massive generator of organic waste, and this waste can become a threat to citizens, or it can become a wealth according to how you treat it. So there's no question that cities have a massive power to shift the way we are thinking and doing with food. We also recognize that cities are the place where trends emerge, innovations are tested, new things are experimented. So if there is a need to redesign the food system, that's probably in cities that it will start. That's our bet.
So you said so 80% of food will be consumed in cities. Sorry, Jaap, I interrupted you there, but I'm going to come to you with a question quickly about not the consumption of food, but the growing of food. How much kind of food is currently grown in cities? And what is the potential for more food to be grown in cities?
Well, the exact numbers are not always easy to guess by to understand how much is grown in cities, but it's clearly a very relatively small amount. What we did find, which wasn't that straightforward or intuitive, is basically that actually a significant proportion of food is grown near cities and within 10 to 20 kilometers. We found that basically 40% of agricultural land sits within 20 kilometers of cities globally, which was a lot more than we realized. So, that linkage is there. It's not so much really within the cities itself, although arguably there's, of course, it is happening in different ways. Now, the potential that you asked about, I mean, we did look into that quite a bit, and particularly also on the whole momentum around this thing called urban agriculture, urban farming, which of course is quite a hot topic. Also, when you look into technology innovations, the indoor farms and the vertical farms, which you hear a lot about. I mean, it's hard to say how big it exactly will become. I mean, it definitely has a role to play, but ultimately, it's in a future food system that actually starts to live a bit more within the limits that it's not today. It's quite hard to see how inner city food growing would be a substantial part of it, and it's actually for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, obviously competing for space with other good users that are sometimes quite scarce in cities. Also, the more, let's say, technology heavy you go, the more vertical farm you go, the more there are still questions around the total energy use for it, and is that really the best way to do that? And therefore, also the economics of it aren't that straightforward yet. So, when you think about, can cities become, completely self-sufficient? I'm sure there's some good cases to be made for city-states like, let's say, Singapore, going quite hard on it, and others. So from that perspective, yes. But when you really look globally overall, it makes a lot more sense to actually fix what we have now, which is the current agriculture system, and really work with that. And think about what you should do there, also from a city perspective.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that again kind of points out the complexity of the system, the fact that you can kind of aim to make a change directly in the city, but the system is so big and complex that it's certainly not going to be the only place that you can look at.
Yeah.
Clem, coming back, you mentioned the waste that's produced in cities as one of the reasons why it's kind of a point of focus and a place where change can happen perhaps quickly. What is it about this waste that kind of is exciting from this project's point of view?
Where to start?
Very interesting topic, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Look, I think you have to look at it from two different angles. The first one is waste by itself has a lot of value, especially linking back to agriculture. So we say lots of organic waste are piling up in cities, and we actually need these valuable nutrients to grow the food that we need for tomorrow to avoid this food gap that you started the session with. So there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen that can be found in these organic waste streams, and they can be channeled back to the agriculture. And that will allow us to put ourselves on track with the planetary boundaries concept for phosphorus and nitrogen. That's one side of the equation. On the other side, if we take the sand from cities, organic waste are a huge cost bucket for cities to deal with. And this is threatening citizens' health, as Jaap alluded to, earlier on. So there's really, it's definitely a win-win for the city to valorize this waste one way or another, put it back in the bioeconomy, maybe in agriculture, maybe in something else. And it's basically something that really has to be done, considering the ramping, rate of urbanization and the increased amount of food that we're going to consume in cities.
Absolutely. It seems like a no-brainer for cities doing this if they can save money on their waste and if it's going to contribute to the health of our food system.
Yep.
Are there cities out there that are already doing this? Are there some examples that are leading the way?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at Milan, for example, it is a well-known case example of a city that has successfully scaled up a organic a separate collection scheme for organic waste. I think we are close to 80% of organic waste being collected through this scheme, which is enormous and which is enabling all sorts of valorization downstream.
Brilliant. I want to move on to, you made the point about reconnecting kind of cities back to the soil and getting those nutrients, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, etc., back to cities. So I want to talk about regenerative agriculture a bit next, so move back out to the rural kind of agricultural section. But before we do that, we have got plenty on at the Diff, as always, every year. And to give you a sense of what is coming up next, here's Emily.
Later on today, at 5 p.m. GMT, we've got materials expert Zoe Lotlin joining us in the live studio for an interactive session called Materials and Making in the Diff Studio. On the topic of food, tomorrow at 12 p.m. GMT, we've got a Diff on Air session called Connecting Farmers to Consumers. It's all about a digital platform called Made in Farm that connects the farmer and the buyer. And of course, don't forget to watch our exclusive documentary and headliner film, Hamilton Henrique, a story of food revolution. This was released last week and is about a social business called Saladomara that provides healthy and accessible food for many in Brazilian favelas. So those are my top tips.
Brilliant. Welcome back. Clem, so I mentioned there regenerative agriculture. We talked about soil degradation and the fact that it's kind of really difficult to get the quality of that soil back up to the necessary quality. We've talked about reconnecting cities and the nutrients that are currently being wasted within cities' waste streams back to that soil, which makes me think of something that I've heard of a few times, obviously working in this space a bit, this regenerative agriculture. What is that?
Yeah. Regenerative agriculture is a set of farming practices that aims to actually farm and produce food, while at the same time nurturing and restoring natural capital, and particularly soil. The way we grow food currently tends to be, degrading soil, taking carbon out of soil more than it actually put it back. So I think regenerative agriculture is really aiming at providing a different dynamic around soil and around soil degradation.
Super. We've had a question in from the audience, which I'm going to direct to you first, Jaap, but I'd like to get Clem's perspective as well. Obviously, that statistic that you shared earlier about how long it takes to rebuild soil health is quite a frightening one. And we had a question on the ThinkDiff website, someone saying, is it even possible to undo the damage that it takes, if it takes 1,000 years to rebuild 1 centimeter? So is there hope?
Otherwise, I wouldn't be here either. No, there is, and it is actually very much linked to the discussion we just started, which is there are practices, and it's really about practice. It's not about technological innovations or whatnot, but different ways of treating land can actually speed up the soil health restoration, the regeneration substantially. And the examples that are typically given are, instead of this monocropping that we talked about before, switching to multi-cropping, which basically forces the soil to grow different species over time, which tends to kind of really improve the health and the diversity and the biodiversity also within the soil. And so there are many other examples of what you could do to actually improve the soil health. And the interesting thing I always find, it's all there. It's been done, and there's nothing new to it. We're not talking about massive revolution in terms of technology. And so yes, absolutely, it can be done.
Clem, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think in the same way that we've been somewhat in a negative spiral with soil degradation, we can reach a stage where we are in a positive spiral, and where more and more regeneration help us reach a stage where we are, out of the danger zone.
Brilliant. Yep, you mentioned that these kind of practices are not new necessarily. If so, why are there not more farmers doing this?
The logical next question, I guess. In part also, I mean, in all honesty, the reality of the yield that it gives, it varies sometimes a bit. I think the reason why we kind of went down the path that we did was also because of the kind of incremental system that we built around it of supporting growth with chemical inputs that indeed showed very positive results, which then led to basically more support around that. I mean, there are many examples all over the world where basically governments are actively subsidizing that, where they are subsidizing monocropping in emerging countries, emerging markets, is still quite a lot the case. And historically, again, for all good reasons. It's just only the last 10, 20, maybe 30 years do we realize that that's maybe not a path we can continue to go down. And so that's why you do see a renewed interest, I would say, into, okay, well, what are alternatives? Where indeed, when you then look around you, you realize that there are very good examples out there that work. Now, the question still remains, does it work at scale? And do we still have enough, food to feed the population and kind of solving all the issues at once? In all honesty, the jury is out on that one. I think it's just hard to really project how that's going to play out.
Yeah. But it is early stage for Regenerative to spread, and I think with time we'll be able to tell,
Yes.
can we actually reach a stage where we are producing the same yields with Regenerative than with conventional farming. So there's, like I was saying, there's still a way to go, but it is definitely the path that we have to take.
Yes, and like you were saying, that not all food is going to be grown in cities. This is part of a kind of much bigger system.
Yeah.
There's obviously going to be kind of a lot of contributors in a lot of different ways in which our kind of food system works, and this is just going to be part of that, is what it seems to me. We've had some more questions from the audience, a flurry in at the moment. You mentioned that it's not just a technological thing, this Regen Ag, but someone on the ThinkDiff website would like to know kind of what are some of the most promising startups or technologies, if there are any out there that you've come across, to regenerate soil? That one's for either of you, whoever wants to take it first.
Without mentioning names or startups in general, I think there is a really crucial need for a new generation of organic fertilizers to emerge and to take the stage, because one of the pillars of regenerative agriculture is to do away without synthetic fertilizers. Currently, there's a lot of compost that is available to farmers, but we really need something that is just more reliant, more sophisticated, safe, and compost doesn't always fit the bill. And also because we want to compete with yields that are now so high, and actually synthetic fertilizer took us a really long way in being able to produce lots and lots of food, and I think we need to find a way to do the same without relying on synthetic fertilizer, and that's where a new generation of organic fertilizer is required.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to add to that, I think when I'm saying it's not a technological advancement, that doesn't mean it's not scientific. I think there's a tremendous amount of science that has gone into this, and that probably still needs to be developed further. And indeed, a lot is around really understanding the biology of indeed soil, crop growth, crop nutrition, where of course there's a lot known, but from my limited, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but from what I hear is there's still a lot of gaps as well. Maybe one example actually on startups is the Breakthrough Energy Fund from Bill Gates and others. They've recently deployed dozens of millions into a company, I think it's called Pivot Bio, who are indeed also looking into this biofertilizer space. So I think that's absolutely an area where there's quite a bit happening. And so the whole microbial solutions as a space is definitely picking up quite a bit these days.
Yeah.
Great.
And if we want to talk about digital capabilities, I think there's a role for digital to play in monitoring and supporting soil health. That's for sure.
Okay, so we actually have digital technologies that can be used to check in on the quality
Yeah.
of our soil and make sure that we're keeping it at that kind of
Yeah.
high level. Brilliant. Something that often comes up as a topic of discussion when talking about agricultural systems, and one that we have not escaped today, which I think is great, is another question from the audience asking about managed grazing. Is this something that you have come across in the research? And if so, what are your thoughts on managed grazing as an approach?
Clemens, look
I'm
at me,
going to go
so
with you,
I'll
yeah.
pick this one up, I guess. So yeah, no, absolutely. So managed grazing is indeed, it's again a practice application of how you use cattle to graze land, and so basically not keeping it the same level of the same spot all the time, but really moving it around over time. And by doing that, basically mimicking the kind of reason that nature also built it up the way they did it, because by taking away part of or grazing some of the land, it allows roots, I believe, to grow a bit better if you then don't overgraze it after that. So the whole idea of grazing them just long enough to basically let the roots grow stronger, so it's the subsoil part, which then holds soil better and therefore increases soil quality. But you got to then move it around quick enough to not to make sure that it's overgrazed, and that kind of kills the whole effect again.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got plenty more questions covering hydroponics and aquaponics, perceptions of food production, individuals' connections to the food system, even genetically modified food. I'm going to hold those for a little while because I'd like to do something a little bit different with the Disruptive Innovation Festival after all. And I've devised a little bit of a game here for us to play, which I like to refer to as...
Whoa!
Radical!
Ew!
Or rotten. Brilliant. So, radical or rotten. What I would like you, Clem and Jaap, to do is to take a look at the following, let's call them potential solutions that can be applied within the food and agriculture space. So we've got regenerative agriculture, which we've talked about a bit. We've got urban vertical farming. Let's include in that kind of some of these technologies like aquaponics and hydroponics.
Yep.
Cultured meats, synthetic meat production, which is quite a hot topic in the news at the moment. A plant-based diet, perhaps behavioral shift towards a plant-based diet, and managed grazing, which we just touched upon. So 5 of presumably many other potential solutions. What I'd like you to do is to take kind of 30 seconds to arrange in your minds, like if you had the power, whatever the power is, to implement these solutions, what would you prioritize? If you kind of rank those in terms of priorities for me in the next 30 seconds, I'd love to get your take on that. Those of you who are watching online, we've got loads of questions which I'm going to come to as soon as possible. Please do keep them coming because they're fantastic material for our panelists to ponder. And part of the diff, as I said, is about you getting involved, sharing your thoughts, your questions, so that we can put them through to our panelists whose time we've got with us here in the studio. Okay, speaking of guests in the studio, have you guys had enough time, do you think?
Yeah.
I have.
All right, I'm going to start with you, Clem. Of those 5 solutions, kind of what's your priority order for them?
Well, definitely Regenerative comes first, without surprise, I think. Managed grazing to me is part of it. You know, it's about rebuilding soil, so
Okay.
that would go together. I think the next one would be probably plant-based diet, with a caveat that I don't think we need to be that extreme as saying no one will eat meat ever. But definitely eating less meat will make everything more prone to succeed. Let's put it that
Okay.
way. The next one for me is probably urban vertical farming. As Jaap was explaining, I think there are definitely limitations to how much vertical farming can do in the current state of things. Vertical farming cannot provide all the calories that are required by citizens simply by, physical rules. It does, however, has some potential to feed us with micronutrients, for example. Vertical farming is another space where innovation is required to make things work a lot better. If we were to find a way to make it less energivore, for example, I think there is, again, a way to reach that potential. And then I would finally close down with culture meats. There's just a lot of question marks on this. Very interesting, fascinating, but it's just too early to tell what will be the potential of this type of agriculture.
Brilliant, thank you. Jaap?
She stole my thunder now. No, I think the order is maybe not surprising, not vastly different. I would almost split it in two. I think the regenerative agriculture, including managed grazing, combined with plant-based diets, are definitely a big step in the right direction. I think they will always have to kind of coexist if we go big on them, for sure. I think, as we discussed, regenerative agriculture as a theme, because in many ways it is a big umbrella term that has a lot of different things hanging under it, is a must-have simply because of the soil problem that we have there. The regeneration of soil is something we just can't get around for much longer. At the same time, the questions regarding the yields and can we feed enough the growing population can be offset, of course, by let's say reduction or leveling off of meat consumption. So that would definitely help a lot. And then I think there's just the other two pieces, which is the typical innovation buckets. Vertical farming, indeed, very interesting, and for sure has already a role to play. Very interesting to see where that could go. A cultured meat, indeed, also still a lot of questions around it, but again, one that we should definitely continue to explore, I think, as a society overall, if you will, simply because there seems to be quite some interesting developments. I still feel, though, that the whole question around should we actually try to chase after replicating meat, or should we just be a lot more explicit about protein sources not being meat and maybe therefore making it a lot more attractive to coexist, is one that's out there a bit. It's still in a way interesting. We're trying to mimic meat, and I think therefore people always look at it as is it now different from meat or not, right? And until we reach perfection, that will always be there, and that may be a bit too long, maybe, but that's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was over in the US a few weeks ago and actually tried one of these meat substitute burgers, one of these new kind of developments, and it was definitely an interesting experience. The burger was tasty, but it wasn't exactly like a regular beef burger. I liked it, but still not exactly the same. So definitely somewhere to go. But that's a very interesting point you have about kind of it brings in people's perceptions of meat and plant-based, and I think people get quite kind of emotionally involved and interested and engaged in kind of a discussion around that, the very nature of what we eat. Yeah. Exactly. So some of those questions that I mentioned we've had from the audience, we'll go through a few of them now. Joe Miller has asked, what do you both think will be the most significant enabler to shifting global food production to a more restorative and resilient system? So enablers to shift the system. Are we talking about policy? Yeah. We've talked about technology a bit. Policy we haven't touched upon. Yeah. Maybe that's an important one.
Another one, so definitely, policy, technology, but I think we should also think about the role of financial instruments in de-risking the transition from conventional farming to regenerative farming. There's a lot of, it is a scary jump, for a farmer to say, I'm going to change everything I've been doing and hope for the best. That's not how it works. So there's definitely a role for financial instrument to come in and help de-risking the whole transition. Otherwise, I think that's really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. Jaap, any others?
Maybe want to add also. What I always find interesting, if you look at the supply chain, the value chain of the food system today, it's very concentrated on the agribusiness side. It's reasonably concentrated on the food buyers, so to the big brands that we all know, and to some extent even the retailers. And then it's very fragmented at the farm level. There are like 450 million farmers across the world, I believe, and there are, I think the top 5 agribusinesses hold 75%, or probably a bit less than that, but a huge chunk of the total market share. And so, without the support of those companies, I think it's going to be very hard to transition this on both sides, both the input and the buying side. So I think that they have a large role to play. And the good thing is that there is actually there is momentum building up around it. You see companies wanting to help out, to some extent de-risking even some of these more transitions for farmers towards other practices, setting up standards. So I think that's a great momentum, but we need more of it.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Sounds like it. Another question from the website by Thomas Leach, who's obviously dwelling on this city element that we've explored in the research and we've talked about a little bit. Thomas wants to know how much of a role architects and maybe urban planners have in solving food security issues within urban areas. Do they have a role to play?
Yeah, definitely. I think, when we look at the complexity of supply chains nowadays to feed cities, it's incredible. And I think it explains also why it is so complicated to know where our food is coming from. Because you may have been able to source something locally, but it has to be transported miles away to be processed and transformed and sterilized and then shipped back. And so any sorts of planning that can simplify the way food flows into cities will be extremely valuable, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Jaap mentioned one of the things that's holding back perhaps urban farming is the lack of space and some of the economics associated with that. So maybe there's a role for architects in kind of designing and shaping the actual landscape of the city to free up some of that space for urban farming?
No, absolutely, and I think there are this what you could call softer elements as well, which I increasingly am convinced do matter. The whole point or the term we also used a bit in our research was around reconnecting people with the way food is grown, and I think particularly in cities, who still really knows where exactly it comes from or how something is grown. I've got 2 young children. I am pretty sure they don't have a clue in a couple of years. So I think, bringing that back and in novel ways where indeed integrating it in buildings on roofs or otherwise would really help, I think. And also just for people to realize where it comes from to then make more conscious buying decisions potentially around, how it's grown and the health aspects that we talked about. I think will make a difference. It's obviously hard to really pinpoint and hard to quantify, but because, like you said, food it is an emotional topic and it's close to all of us and it's important to all of us. I think we can't underestimate that part in the whole transition.
No, absolutely not. So we've got both of you here on the Disruptive Innovation Festival because you're experts in this topic. You've been looking at it for the past few months as part of a project that's ongoing. Can you give us a little bit of an update on what are some of the findings that you've come across? Any teasers? I know it hasn't been released yet, but any teasers you can throw out to us at this early stage?
Yeah, so the initiative looks at the potential for circular economy to help solve some of the issues that we've been touching upon on the food production side of things. Report will be out in a few months, as you've been just mentioned, but I think what's really interesting is that if you look at different levers that we've qualified as circular economy levers, there's a significant part of the externalities of the food production that can be tackled. And we were talking, is there a way out of this situation? And I think, yes, there is. And this is the vision that we've been trying to describe.
Brilliant. And that report, when will we be able to read it and find out some of the stuff you've been looking at in more detail?
It will be launched at the World Economic Forum next January. So by the end of January, everything will be published.
Brilliant.
Maybe just a reflection from my side on it. I think what I took away from it is indeed how, let's call it circular principles, actually really allow you to think about it holistically in terms of what needs to be done. I think the whole nutrient recycling that we talked about and bringing nutrients back to the fields obviously requires to some extent a part of the practice differences, because it basically requires farmers to switch from synthetic or chemical fertilizers to more organic driven fertilizers. And equally, what we elaborate on quite a bit is this whole notion of the whole cities and the consumer buying power that holds and the companies that actually manage that through the marketing and whatnot, how that then kind of also can connect back to the fields and help farmers to transition. And also, for example, saying, well, you don't want to be recycling nutrient of food waste that you can actually prevent. So it's it is an integrated view of all the steps of which matter, and none of which can happen to the full extent without each other. So I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it, because although a lot of research and pieces have been done before, many of them look at only parts of those issues, which is great. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it's about the integrated perspective and how to push that forward as a whole.
Wonderful. No, I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. Those of you listening online, you probably picked up there that both Clem and Jaap refer to the circular economy and circular principles. If that is a term that's new to you, the Disruptive Innovation Festival has got you covered. You can find or search for the Circular Economy Learning Journey, which has been put together to give you an introduction to this topic of the circular economy, the core principles, which Jaap referred to, that can be implemented, we believe, to improve and build a more resilient food system. So if that is going to be of interest to you, then be sure to check it out. Clem, Jaap, we have talked a lot about kind of the system take on this, the interconnected nature of the food system, how cities play into this. I wonder if we can bring it down to the kind of personal level here. Someone who's watching this online at the moment kind of is hearing about the health implications, the 1,000 years it takes to rebuild topsoil, and all of these system changes that could happen to improve the system. What can they kind of individually start to think about or start to do to play their part in this transition?
Mm-hmm. So if we look at food consumption and choosing what food you consume, I think there's already quite a lot that you can do. We've discussed meat consumption, alternative meat, and proteins. Definitely not all sources of protein are created equal, particularly when we look at their impact on natural resources. So I think being more conscious of those choices is step one. When it comes to sourcing the food that you consume, there's also something that can easily be applied on a daily basis. Is just wondering, where does my food come from, and am I leveraging agriculture that is nearby? We've discussed how many actually of croplands are actually located in nearby cities, which means that in theory most cities will be able to fulfill their food needs with what is already existing. However, when we look at what people consume, very little is coming from local agriculture. So we would encourage people to look into that. And obviously, more importantly, how is my food grown? People should be able to ask and answer that question. And I know that it's not easy. You can't go in a store and pick up a regeneratively grown carrot. That doesn't exist yet. But with the right consumer awareness and with the right push, we could get to a point where a label or a certification allow people to make this choice in the near future.
Brilliant. Jaap, anything to
I would
add?
say, I mean, of course, there are already quite a few certification schemes out there, most of which you can probably ask a few questions. How, are they perfect, or how good are they? But I mean, all of them, most of them, I would say, do move in the right direction, at least, varying from let's say organic to palm oil, sustainable palm oil, to sustainable fisheries. I mean, there's all kinds of certification schemes, and it's too much detail to go into every one of them now. But I think that at least allows consumers to buy already a bit more conscious. But to Clem's point, I mean, that doesn't bring us fully there yet. But I think the whole point around organic farming is, by the way, one that I also wanted to make sure we touch upon, because it is so relatively big already today. I mean, about 5 or 6% of EU farmland today is organic, which is quite a significant part of the market. And in many ways, the way I would think about this is, it's a step in the right direction. It's not there yet, and there's absolutely research is showing how it could, in some dimensions, even be worse than conventional, because of, let's say, the fertilizers, not the organic fertilizer being applied very inefficiently. So clearly, lots of room for optimization. But it does bring a few steps, in the right direction in terms of, the recycling of nutrients element. Does bring it in, reducing it where you can. In some cases, even as soil health restoration as an element to it. So I think just supporting that, but at the same time, and this is why indeed the whole systems problems comes in. It can't just be consumers by themselves, but being supported then by organizations that help the farmers to transition further and define also what that means, because it's not always that obvious, should gradually get us there. And indeed, I mean, to Glenn's point, the other big one is obviously had the whole idea around, let's say, become a bit more flexitarian where you can, is always good from the food system overall perspective. Yeah.
And let's not forget organic waste.
No.
We all have a role to play in making sure that organic waste is collected in the right bin and valorized downstream. This is actually really important.
So we've covered a lot of ground in quite a short space of time, a range of different topics. I wonder if you can kind of both quite kind of succinctly sum up what you think the future food system should and could look like, if it's going to be one that's healthy both for individuals and for kind of the planet. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Okay, shall I
Shall
try?
we start with Clem?
Okay.
Go for it.
Whew. So I think to me, when I envision the future food system, I see something where every meal has the potential to fulfill people's health, provide them with the nutrition, the energy that they require, while at the same time nurturing natural systems and the economy as a whole. Agriculture should be diverse, it should be regenerating soil, it should be a carbon sink, sequestering carbon, and it should not pollute air or water. By contrast, it should be cleaning air and water, and it should also support biodiversity, which is a point that we haven't really discussed, but is also really important. And I think, so that's for the agricultural side of things. When it comes to what people eat, their food should be, again, diverse. It should rely on different sources of proteins, some of them, being alternative sources of protein, sourcing locally and regeneratively as much as possible, making sure that food waste is prevented whenever avoidable, and when it's not avoidable, organic waste should be valorized to become a revenue stream more than a costly waste streams. And all of that should be enabled by, scientific advancements, technology, innovation. And as we discussed, policy and financial instruments have a key role to play.
Sounds wonderful to me. Jaap, your take?
Well, maybe just again to add to it, because Clem already covered a lot.
She did.
I think taking the consumer perspective from that and having that system in place, but then while food is continues to be affordable or continues to become more affordable for in certain parts of the world, allowing people to make conscious decisions around what they eat, but also in a way that it's not too burdensome for a lot, because in many ways that's also withholding people sometimes, I guess, from making conscious dietary choices. I think all matter a lot, and so it's not just about, let's say, it's to some extent, to a large extent, knowing where your food comes from and understanding what it does and what it does to you as well as to the broader environment, but equally also keeping the costs manageable and the treatment of the food also easy to handle, because that's also what we're a lot about these days. I think all matters.
Wonderful. I think that is the perfect place to end our discussion today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Clem, for joining us here in the studio, and Jaap for dialing in on our diff big screen. Those of you who've watched with us over the past 45, 50 minutes, there is still plenty more at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. Thank you for sending your questions and your comments through. I'm sorry if I didn't manage to get through to all of them, but maybe if there's someone in the audience who has the answers to any unanswered questions there, you can post them. Coming up at the diff, you heard from Emily about some of the sessions coming up. I'm certainly going to be checking out the session at 5 p.m. this evening, UK time, looking at materials and making here in the diff studio. I think that's going to be really exciting. And if you want to hear some more about food, if that's really what you're interested in here at the diff, then I can also recommend a session that you can view on Catch Up from last week, Friday, which was called Feeding 1/5 Circular Food in China. That's it for us here in the diff studio. It's time for us to go and grab some lunch after all this food talk. We will see you again soon.